For over 3,000 years, they were scattered across the world. Scientists collected samples of genes from 6 continents, from Poland to Ethiopia,
What they
from India
experienced
to
was
Morocco,
something
from
slower
Yemen
and
to
in
the
some
United
ways
States.
more
They
unsettling.
compared
A
these full
city
sets
that
of genes
gradually,
against every
over
major human group of
generations,
people on the
became
planet.
impossible to
And when the
live in.
data finally
The
came
ground
back,
beneath it was
what they
always
found
moving.
did
The
not just
Nile
rewrite
Delta
the history of one group of people, it rewrote the story of how human groups survive, scatter, keep going, and remember each other, not in their traditions, not in their languages, but hidden deep inside their own biology. There is a question that scientists have been circling around for decades, coming close to it slowly, picking their words carefully, double-checking their numbers, running the tests again. The question is so simple, it tricks you. It sounds almost too easy for a laboratory. Who were the Jewish people in terms of biology? Not in the religious sense, not in the cultural sense, not in the political sense, but in the purely gene-based, molecular, chromosome-level
of
sense.
seabed,
Who are they?
covered in
Where did they really
sediment,
come from?
with no name
And
on any
after
existing
2,000
map.
years of living in
It
Europe,
had not been
in
on
North
any
Africa,
map for
in
over
Central
1,000
Asia,
years.
in India, and
Because
Ethiopia,
the city those
what did that do
objects
to their
belonged
DNA?
to had
These
been
are the questions that population gene scientists at Harvard, Hebrew University, Columbia University, and places of learning across Europe set out to answer. And when they did, the results forced them to go back and rethink what they thought they understood about human genetic memory. Start with the numbers, because the numbers themselves are amazing. The world's core Jewish population today is about 16.5 million people, just 0.2% of the 8.28 billion human beings on this planet. That is an incredibly tiny fraction of humanity. And yet, this tiny population has been scattered across nearly every major civilization in human history.
Alexandria
They
had
were
risen to
pushed
commercial
out,
supremacy,
killed, rebuilt,
and the
pushed
memory
out
of
again,
Thonis
and rebuilt
Heracleion,
again
the
across a
city
stretch of
that had been the
time, so
gateway
long
to
it
Egypt
makes
for
modern
1,000
nations look like
years,
short experiments.
faded from
The Roman
active
Empire
knowledge
fell,
into
the Byzantine
mythology,
Empire
into
fell,
near
the
total
Ottoman
forgetting.
Empire fell. Jewish communities kept going all that time, and through all of it, they kept something else. Their genetic code. This is not chaos. This is survival written into biology. The first thing scientists expected to find when they started serious gene comparisons in the early 2000s was that Jewish populations would look genetically similar to wherever they had been living the longest. Common sense would say that Ashkenazi Jews, those whose ancestors lived in Central and Eastern Europe for roughly 1,000 years, would look genetically like Germans, Poles, or Russians. It would suggest that Moroccan Jews would look like Berbers,
To find
that
64
Iranian
in a
Jews would
single
look like
location,
Persians, that
in a range of
Ethiopian Jews
sizes and
would look like
origins
other
that reflects the
Ethiopians.
full diversity of
Geography,
ancient
time, and
maritime
marriage between
trade
groups
is
tend to
something
do
that has
to
never
populations.
happened
They
anywhere
mix them
else in the
together.
history
They
of
smooth the edges. They erase the origins. That is the normal story of human migration and blending in. The Jewish story is not the normal story. Autosomal
places
DNA
far
studies,
south of
which are
Egypt,
studies looking
to
at the
Nubia,
22
to
non-sex
Kush,
chromosomes
to the
that carry
civilization.
most of human genetic information, show high levels of genetic closeness among Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi Jews, pointing to a shared Middle Eastern ancestry with differences in local mixing. Think about what that sentence actually means. Communities separated by an ocean of geography, by different languages, by different food traditions, by different religious customs that grew on their own over centuries. When you strip all of that away and look at the raw genetic data, they are still pointing to the same starting place. Autosomal DNA evidence
of
supports the
sub-Saharan
historical
Africa
story of Jewish
that maintain
populations,
continuous
starting from the
commercial
ancient
and
Levant, with genetic variety shaped by migrations, mixing of groups, and isolation over thousands of years. The Levant, today's Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, that small strip of Mediterranean coast where Africa, Asia, and Europe meet. That is where the genetic signal keeps returning no matter where the people ended up. And here is where it gets remarkable. Even after centuries of being scattered, which brought in local genetic markers from Europe, North Africa, and Asia, a common biological thread continues across Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi family lines. The genomic data shows that most Jewish groups around the world share more genetic things in common with one another and with other Levantine populations, such as Druze and Palestinians, than they do with their former host populations in the diaspora. The people they lived next to for 1,000 years left less of a genetic mark on them than their ancestors who lived in the same land 3,000 years ago. Read that again. 1,000 years of living among European populations left a smaller genetic mark than 3,000 years of shared ancestry in a place most of them had never personally walked in. That is not something genetics is supposed to be able to do. That is not how blending in is supposed to work. But the story does not end there. Because once scientists began digging deeper into the different branches of this global Jewish scatter, they found something even more surprising. The Ashkenazi branch, the one that would go on to make up roughly half of all Jews alive today, carries a genetic mystery that is unlike almost anything else documented in modern population science. The group's model of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry suggests that the population's history was shaped by three critical shrinking events. Their ancestors, like all humans, went through a shrinking around 85,000 to 91,000 years ago, at the same time as a leaving Africa event. A founding European population went through a shrinking about 21,000 years ago, and then a third terrible shrinking happened in the Middle Ages, cutting the Ashkenazi population down to under 350 people. 350 people. That is not a population. That is a large extended family. That is less than the number of students in a single school building. And from those 350 people, the modern Ashkenazi Jewish world, which today numbers in the millions, would come from. Research published by Nature Communications found that the Ashkenazi Jewish population came from an even mix between Middle Eastern and European peoples, descending from 330 to 350 people who were about half Middle Eastern and half European in their genes, making all Ashkenazi Jews related to the point of being at least 30th cousins or closer. Every Ashkenazi Jewish person alive on this planet today, every single one, is at least a 30th cousin to every other Ashkenazi Jewish person. They are all connected, not by metaphor, not by culture, but by shared DNA pieces that scientists can literally trace and measure. This genetic shrinking likely happened some 600 to 800 years ago, followed by fast growth and genetic isolation at a rate of 16 to 53% per generation. The medieval period, the era of the Black Death, the Crusades, the Rhineland massacres, history's violence and isolation became biology's blueprint. And this is where everything changes. Because what happens when you take 350 people and then from that tiny gene pool grow a population of millions? The random gene quirks of those founding people, traits that in a larger population would have blended out, been watered down, disappeared, instead become bigger. They become more concentrated. They become a key part of who they are. Scientists have a clear name for this thing. They call it the founder effect. And in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, the founder effect did something that has fascinated and troubled geneticists in equal measure. It made certain genetic diseases a lot more common. Medieval persecutions cut the Ashkenazi population down to as few as 350 people around 800 to 1,000 years ago. These changes locked in rare hidden gene copies, leading to carrier rates far higher than in general populations. The consequences of this can be measured in specific numbers. 1 in 27 Ashkenazi Jews carries the Tay-Sachs mutation, compared to 1 in 250 around the world. 1 in 10 carries Gaucher disease mutations, compared to 1 in 100 non-Jews. The founder effect, and later genetic drift, led to a higher number of certain autosomal recessive disorders, making about 16 inherited conditions much more common in the Ashkenazi population, many of them serious brain disorders, including Tay-Sachs disease, Canavan disease, and familial dysautonomia. But here is where the science takes an unexpected turn, because while it would be easy to look at these higher disease rates as only bad outcomes, some researchers have noticed something strange about how they are spread out. 4 of these diseases, Tay-Sachs, Gaucher disease, mucolipidosis type 4, and Niemann-Pick disease, are the result of problems in sphingolipid storage. This unusual gathering of fat storage diseases suggests that nature may have favored carriers of gene copies affecting fat metabolism and storage, possibly because of resistance to tuberculosis. The medieval streets of Europe were hit hard by tuberculosis for centuries. If carrying one copy of a gene change that caused a terrible disease in a double dose offered some protection against a deadly epidemic, then natural selection would have quietly, invisibly kept it, even while burying children who inherited 2 copies. Biology does not aim for what we want, it aims for survival. About 1 in 40 people of Ashkenazi Jewish origin have a BRCA gene change, compared to 1 in 250 people in the general population. These changes greatly increase the risk of breast, ovarian, prostate, and pancreatic cancers. And here the founder effect's leftover becomes deeply personal for millions of living people, not as a history lesson, not as abstract science, but as a medical fact that doctors in the United Kingdom now test for. In particular, the NHS, England Jewish BRCA testing program, offers BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene testing to people with at least one Jewish grandparent, recognizing their higher chance of having an Ashkenazi Jewish founder gene variant compared to the general population. The medieval shrinking still shows up in modern cancer wards. The genetics of being targeted, of isolation, of surviving against impossible odds, is still being diagnosed today. Now look at the other branches, because each tells a different chapter of the same unfinished story. The Sephardic Jews, those whose ancestors were kicked out of Spain and Portugal in 1492 after the order of Ferdinand and Isabella, carry a genetic profile that reflects both their ancient Middle Eastern roots and their centuries of movement around the Mediterranean. In multidimensional genetic analysis, Sephardic populations form a group separate from the Ashkenazi and North African populations. Their genes sit in between these two groups, as if they are positioned almost exactly between the world they came from and the world they passed through. After the expulsion, Sephardic Jews scattered across the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, the Netherlands, the Americas, and yet their DNA still carries that Levantine signature, weaker perhaps, mixed by centuries of Mediterranean life, but clearly still there. Then there are the Mizrahi Jews, the ones who, in a sense, never left the neighborhood, the Jews of Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Syria, Egypt, Morocco, communities that trace their unbroken presence in those lands back to the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE. Mizrahi Jews, who stayed in the Middle East and North Africa, show the strongest genetic links to the ancient Levant, the historic region in the eastern Mediterranean that includes today's Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and parts of Turkey. These are the communities with the most direct, least watered-down genetic connection to the ancient source. When scientists look at Mizrahi Jewish genomes, they are probably looking at the closest living copy of what the ancient Israelite population may have looked like, and their existence makes every simple story about who Jews really are, what they really look like, and where they really belong more complicated. About 4.6 million Mizrahi Jews come from Jews who settled not far from Israel in Southwest Asia and parts of northern Africa. They did not go to Europe. They did not experience the medieval shrinking that shaped the Ashkenazi genome so dramatically. They lived for thousands of years as small groups in Arab and Persian cities, Baghdad, Tehran, Cairo, Sana'a, holding on to their religious identity while taking in some local genetic influence, but never losing that deep Levantine core. But then the scientists turned to the cases that really pushed the limits of what they thought they would find. The Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel, a community that had lived in the highlands of Ethiopia for centuries, possibly thousands of years, practicing a form of Judaism completely cut off from the mainstream Jewish world. No Talmud, no rabbis, a Judaism frozen in an earlier age. Ethiopian Jews share genetic features with neighboring African populations, showing their regional roots. Their DNA looks mostly East African in their maternal lines and their paternal lines. They group with other Ethiopian populations far more than they group with Ashkenazi or Sephardic Jews. Ethiopian Jews and Indian Jews are thought to be culturally different and not part of the Ashkenazi, Sephardic, or Mizrahi main groupings. And what about the Indian Jews? The Bene Israel of Mumbai, the Cochin Jews of Kerala, communities that have practiced Judaism on the Indian subcontinent for centuries. Their roots, told in their own oral tradition, trace back to shipwrecked Jewish merchants from ancient Israel. Indian Jews such as the Bene Israel and Cochin Jews mostly show local South Asian maternal lines alongside some shared Jewish genetic markers. Their DNA is overwhelmingly South Asian. They look like Indians in their genes. Yet they kept up Jewish practices, Hebrew prayers, and food rules across isolation so complete that they created their own unique traditions without any contact with the wider Jewish world for nearly 2,000 years. Think about what this means for a moment. The Jewish world contains populations that are genetically African, populations that are genetically South Asian, populations that are genetically half European and half Middle Eastern, and populations that are almost purely ancient Levantine. And yet scientists studying all of them at the same time were able to find shared genetic markers that cross every one of those profiles. When scientists study genetic patterns among Jewish populations worldwide, they find that Jewish communities, whether Ashkenazi, Sephardic, or Mizrahi, share more DNA than their non-Jewish neighbors. The finding of shared identity by descent pieces, long stretches of identical DNA showing common ancestry, suggests these communities kept up strong marriage within the group for centuries. But here's the layer that most people are not seeing. There was a Harvard Medical School study published in the journal Cell that took this question in a direction nobody had quite gone before. Instead of looking only at living people's genomes, they pulled ancient DNA from old remains, teeth pulled from a medieval Jewish cemetery in Erfurt, Germany. They were literally reading the genetic record of the past directly, not guessing it from living descendants. The largest study so far of ancient DNA from Jewish individuals showed surprising genetic subgroups in medieval German Ashkenazi Jews and shed light on the founding event in which a small population gave rise to most present-day Ashkenazi Jews. The analysis revealed two clearly different subgroups within the remains. One with more Middle Eastern ancestry, which may be Jews with roots in Western Germany, and another with more Eastern and Central European ancestry. Two genetically different communities were buried in the same cemetery, two groups living next to each other side by side in medieval Erfurt, going to the same synagogue, speaking the same language, but carrying clearly different genetic profiles. The modern Ashkenazi population formed as a mix of these groups and took in little to no outside genetic influences over the 600 years that followed. 600 years in the middle of Europe. Some disease-causing gene changes that are common in modern Ashkenazi Jews are thought to have been brought in by members of the founding group long ago, and the team found some of these gene changes in Erfurt as well, showing that the medieval Ashkenazi population really did come from an extremely small set of founders. More evidence came from mitochondrial DNA analyses, showing that 1/3 of the people traced in their maternal line from a single ancestral woman. One woman, one set of mitochondria, one line of mother-to-child inheritance, and 1/3 of an entire medieval Jewish community traced back to her. And then the scientists found something else that nobody expected, something that seemed to belong in a different story entirely. A study published in a peer-reviewed journal looked at mitochondrial DNA variation across tens of thousands of people from East Asian populations and from Jewish communities. Analysis of the mtDNA variation in a total of 23,021 people from East Asian populations and Jews shows that mtDNAs of 4 Ashkenazi Jewish individuals can be placed into Eastern Eurasian haplogroups, suggesting that Ashkenazi Jews received a genetic contribution from East Asia. The differentiation time of this line is estimated at about 14,800 years ago, which fits well with historical records, and shows that the exchange between Jews in the Far East was not only about culture, but also spread to the genetic level. The ancient Silk Road, that huge network of trade routes linking the Mediterranean to China, apparently carried more than silk and spices. It carried people, and some of those people left a mark in the Ashkenazi genome that is still visible today, more than 1,000 years later. This is not chaos. This is history recorded in chemistry. Now, consider the wider meaning of what all of this research, taken together, is actually saying. A 2012 landmark study, led by Harry Oster, at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, looked at the genes of 509 Jewish donors from 15 different backgrounds, alongside 114 non-Jewish donors. Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews were found to be closer genetically to each other than to their long-term host populations, and all were found to have Middle Eastern ancestry with different amounts of local mixing in their local populations. Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews were found to have split off from each other about 2,500 years ago, about the time of the Babylonian exile. 2,500 years, 2,500 years ago, a political disaster. The conquest of Judea by Babylon, the forced moving of its people, sent two streams of Jewish life in different directions. One went east into the heart of what is now Iraq and Iran. One eventually went west into Europe. 2,500 years later, the genomes of their descendants still mark the moment of that separation. These findings have important meaning for the ongoing debate about Jewish identity in history. For years, some critics, especially anti-Zionists, have argued that Jews are not native to the Middle East, but are instead the descendants of converts or foreign populations. The genetic evidence does not support that story. What the genetic evidence supports is a story of ancient origin, terrible scattering, partial but incomplete blending in, and lasting biological identity across distances and timescales that would have erased almost any other population group. A big 2020 study concluded that modern Jewish populations, along with other Levantine groups, got more than half of their ancestry from populations related to the ancient Canaanites, pointing to a continuous biological presence and deep ancestral roots in the region for over 3,000 years. There is something worth stopping on here, something that the raw data cannot fully explain. How does a population keep this level of genetic togetherness across 2,500 years of being scattered? What stops the complete genetic absorption that normally happens to any small minority living inside a large majority culture? The answer is a mix of social structure and historical circumstance that is almost unique in human history. Endogamy, the practice of marrying within the community, keeps the genetic boundaries in place. Persecution, in a strange twist, made that endogamy stronger. When outside societies made it illegal, dangerous, or socially catastrophic for Jewish people to marry non-Jews, they were, without meaning to, helping keep a distinct genetic line alive. The very forces designed to destroy this people helped, in a specific biological sense, to preserve what made them genetically recognizable. And then, there is the amazing toughness of the numbers themselves. The so-called demographic miracle of population growth saw the Ashkenazi community grow from 50,000 people at the start of the 15th century to 5 million people at the start of the 19th century. from 50,000 to 5 million in 4 centuries. That is not normal population growth. That is an explosive growth from a terribly small starting point, a population that had been squeezed by medieval persecution and then released into a demographic race that multiplied all of those founder effect traits, all of those genetic quirks, across millions of new people. Every making bigger of the founding genetics happened faster than it would have in a more stable population, because the population itself was growing faster. A large share of people with detectable Ashkenazi Jewish genetic ancestry do not know they have that ancestry. Of about 2,000 BRCA mutation carriers who gave self-reported ancestry information, 21% did not report Jewish ancestry themselves. Yet, of these people, more than half do have detectable Ashkenazi Jewish genetic ancestry. The genetic signal, in other words, continues even when the cultural identity has been lost, forgotten, or deliberately hidden. Centuries of conversion, of blending in, of deliberate erasing of identity, and the DNA still carries the information. The biology remembers what the history forgot. What the scientists did not find is just as important to understand. They did not find evidence of racial ranking. They did not find evidence of a genetically superior or inferior group. They found something much more interesting, a population that was shaped by one of history's most unusual combinations of disaster and persistence. The shrinkings were devastating. The persecutions were real. The forced isolation had biological results, some of them deeply harmful in the form of inherited disease, some of them possibly helpful in ways that are still being studied. None of this fits into the rough frameworks of racial pseudoscience that both anti-Semites and some extreme nationalists have at different times and in different directions tried to force onto Jewish genetics. The actual science is stranger, more specific, and more human than any of those frameworks allow. What the research finally reveals is something that goes beyond any single population. It shows how biology works as a kind of historical record. It shows how a small founding group can leave a genetic mark that echoes for 30 generations. It shows how human beings carry inside their cells the memory of migrations, disasters, separations, and survivals that happened centuries before their birth. Every human being on this planet is in some way carrying that kind of record. Now, what makes the Jewish population unusual is not that they carry it. It is that the specific circumstances of their history made that record unusually clear, unusually distinct, unusually possible to trace. The Harvard study at Erfurt found that the modern Ashkenazi population's genome appeared as a near-even mix between the two medieval subgroups, with roughly 60% of modern Ashkenazi DNA coming from the group with more Middle Eastern ancestry and 40% from the group with more Central European ancestry. Those two communities, separated by geography and possibly by social status in medieval Germany, eventually blended into a single genetic identity. And that merged identity is now carried by millions of people across America, Israel, Europe, and beyond, many of whom have never heard of Erfurt, never visited Germany, and have no conscious connection to the medieval city where the threads of their biology were woven together. The 2025 study by Livy and Skarecki found that fewer than 15% of people in the Ashkenazi sample carried mitochondrial DNA lines that entered the population after it was founded, confirming with the most modern tools available that the motherline genetic core of the Ashkenazi population is ancient, stable, and mostly of Middle Eastern origin. The question that started all of this research, who are the Jewish people in terms of biology, turns out to have an answer that is at the same time precise and open-ended. They are mostly, in their genes, descendants of an ancient Levantine population that scattered, adapted, survived, and left a biological record so lasting that it can be read 3,000 years later in the saliva of someone who has never left New York, Moscow, or Buenos Aires. But here is the question that the science cannot yet fully answer. What does it mean for the tens of thousands of people who find out through commercial DNA testing that they carry Ashkenazi Jewish genetic markers without knowing they had Jewish ancestry? What does it mean for the people in North Africa, in Spain, in Portugal, descendants of families that converted during the Inquisition 500 years ago, who now see Middle Eastern ancestry lighting up in their results? What does it mean for the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, whose genetics look mostly African, but who have practiced Judaism for so long that scholars still debate whether they come from ancient Israelites or from African converts? What does it mean for the Bene Israel of India, whose DNA looks South Asian, but whose prayer book is Hebrew? And what does it mean for the larger question of how identity really works? Is a people defined by their culture, their religion, their history, or by something that sits in a string of DNA letters that they did not choose and cannot change. The DNA gives us amazing accuracy about the past. It does not give us any simple answer about meaning. And that gap between what the genome can tell us and what we still do not know how to do with that information is where the most important questions are still waiting to be asked. The results shocked everyone. Not because they revealed something horrible, but because they revealed something far more complex, more tough, and more historically layered than anyone expected. And the deeper that technology lets scientists read the genetic record, the clearer it becomes that what we thought we understood about identity, ancestry, and biological continuity was only the beginning of the story. The full story is still being read.